Welcome back to the Mature Male Podcast. I'm your host, Wes, a psychotherapist helping men mature through timeless wisdom and practical guidance. Today's guest is Jindy Mann. Jindy is a leadership coach, organizational consultant, and men's work facilitator with over 20 years' experience working in large organizations and startups. His life is driven by one central question: what's really going on? Alongside his coaching and consulting practice, he's the founder of Leader, Brother, Son, an organization facilitating spaces for real and meaningful conversations between men. These spaces allow men to explore topics that are often left unspoken and enable them to relate and connect in ways that they may not feel able to elsewhere. From this work and his ongoing research, he also writes, speaks, and facilitates workshops to share insights on men and masculinity. Jindy, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Wes. Looking forward to this conversation.
I am as well. So let's start with that central driving question: what's really going on? I'm curious, particularly as it relates to men and masculinity in our current moment. What led you to that question, and what are you discovering as you dig deeper into what's really happening beneath the surface for men today?
So I realized before I started doing this work with men that this was the question that I was living, really, that had driven me and motivated me throughout my life, and had led me to my other work as well, coaching, consulting, and working with organizations. This kind of curiosity about what's really going on beyond what appears to be going on the surface. And when I went to university, I actually wanted to be a journalist, but was kind of persuaded that it wasn't a career in which you make good money and all those sorts of things. My parents were immigrants from India, so they, had this idea that you've got to go into a secure career, you make good money, those sorts of things. So I ended up doing a couple of business degrees almost by accident. But I think that journalistic interest stayed with me. And so when I came to starting to work with men, doing groups with men, and getting curious about what was happening, what I was seeing around me, both with me, but also my friends and family, that question really felt central to that work. What's really going on? Not just what are we saying on the surface, but what are we not paying attention to? What are we not having conversations about? We've never had conversations about or never have expressed in some way in our lives. So it was a question that was already there, and it's one that turns out I've just been given from the start.
Yeah, I appreciate that language of given. I've heard it said when it comes to calling that you don't choose the calling chooses you, in a sense. And that there tends to be one core wounding or deep question that drives a lot of our purpose and meaning. And it seems like that had already started in you and your ability to recognize that, unpack it, and unfold it. In a sense, was the path, but also led you on the path to where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really nicely put. I think there's a number of experiences and challenges throughout my life, many of them really difficult, that um, that perhaps shaped or influenced that question. And at times, for a long time, actually, the having that level of curiosity about the world was really difficult because I didn't have the awareness or the healing in myself, or the toolkit to kind of actually handle that question. And I was trying to make sense of things at a deeper level, but actually that created a lot of discomfort, anxiety, stress, pressure. And a lot of my friends would say to me, "You overthink everything." And that was kind of true because that was a level at which I was thinking about things, but it was driven by that same curiosity. I'm trying to make sense of things. I'm trying to make sense of what's really going on here. But at the start of or earlier in my journey, it was all from the head, and it was all very kind of left hemisphere rational. And there was so much for me to resolve in my own journey. So at times it was really, really difficult, but it was only by kind of getting through those parts of my journey and continuing that it's led me to what I'm doing now.
Yeah, I resonate with that sense of seeing the potential of what you want to do and that desire, but not having the capability because of the woundedness that requires such deep attention and care and a lot of humility. Because I think, myself included, you can get this vision or idea to pursue, but it's subject to the capacity of that hard work of healing. And I find many of us men have these really idealistic ways we want to live, but we overlook these simple but really difficult commitments of what it means to make sense of our past and our world. And one of the main defense mechanisms is, as you said, processing in the head only, which is important, obviously, to be a rational person. I think we would both agree that that's core, but that's not it. There's something deeper. And I'm wondering for you, what were some of those signs that helped you maybe distinguish head processing versus heart processing, and why that's so important?
Most of my early career, even middle part of my career so far, was in very rational dominated environments. So consulting, corporate startups, lots of sort of problem solving from this side of the brain. And that made it, at times, made it very difficult to be the way I am, because I was constantly curious about, yeah, but what about this? What about that? Let's broaden this, what's going on here? And in the context of a consulting project, the answer was, look, just get on with it. This is the solution we're trying to get to. Stop overthinking it. Stop sort of thinking broader. But one of the things that I had a kind of early career midlife crisis around the age of 30, where I realized, okay, I'm in this career, this consulting company. I enjoy it and I'm good at it, but I also know that this is not my place. I don't want to stay here longer term. I look at the people who are partners and senior in the organization, and they're all really rich but really miserable, and they never see their families, and that's not the path I want to go on. But I don't know what I do want to do, and that was a really difficult realization. Felt quite sort of lost and confused and quite alone with that realization of, okay, I don't want to do this, but this is the path I've been on for a decade now, and I've arrived in this place. I'm quite good at this work, but I don't want to do it anymore. And I started working with a coach, and that for me was the starting point of so much growth and development, but more importantly for me, self-awareness. I really started to reflect on who I am, what I really want. And I thought I was doing that with the intention of figuring out my next career move. But what I was really doing without realizing was beginning to unpick and uncover and surface a lot of the wounding that needed healing, and making sense of how I'd arrived at this place, who I really was, what had happened in my childhood that I hadn't dealt with, all of these sorts of things. And that took the best part of a decade. I mean, it's a journey that still continues now. But it was the best part of a decade before I felt like I'd arrived at a place where I felt much more certain about who I was and what I wanted to do. And the first 5 or 6 years of that, looking back now, were really quite an unpleasant few years. Constant sense of, what am I doing here? Everyone else seems to know what they're doing. They're on this path. I've left this path. Everyone else is getting on with their lives. I seem to be figuring stuff out in my early 30s, and that feels, frightening and confusing and lonely. But looking back now, I'm so glad I did it. If I'd I realize now that actually, in some sense, that's early to start that process. So to come to your question of that was part of what led me towards being more heart-centered, I guess, and less rational. But I also had some experiences that just defied rational explanation. I really felt like I got hit over the head by, some messages from somewhere else. And one of them, again, a lot of things happened around the age of 30. When I was 30, I hiked Kilimanjaro with my brother, and we were in a guided group, and there's about 12 people in this group. And there was a couple called Mike and Liz, a British couple, both 60. They were the fittest people in the group, and they exuded this really sort of positive energy. They just had a can-do attitude, and they were the first people to summit. They just had this really sort of vibrant energy. I was quite drawn to both of them. And I was speaking to Liz early in the trip, and I asked her what she did, and she said, I'm a master Reiki practitioner. And I was like, I don't really know what that is. I've kind of heard of it. Tell me about what it is. And she said, okay, well, it's kind of working with chakras and energy in the body. And I don't know what my response was in that moment, but I imagine it was probably skeptical, cynical. She probably picked up on it. I was deep in my consulting mindset. So she didn't, we didn't speak about it much more for the rest of the trip. But then on the last day of the trip, we'd summited. We were kind of heading down. We were 2 days after summit. By now, we've been on the mountain for 11 days. We're exhausted. We've been eating, bad food. We've had bad stomach. We've had altitude sickness. Not slept for 3 or 4 days. And I was walking down the trail with my brother, and my back suddenly went into spasm, on one side of my back, in the middle of my back, like a golf ball size pain, just like I'd been hit by a lightning bolt. And I just immediately sort of went into sort of spasm and dropped my rucksack, and I was kind of screaming in agony. My brother said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Oh, it's my back, it's my back." And I went over to the side of the trail and just leaned against this tree, and that was all I could do. Just couldn't move because the pain was so great. And then Liz came down the trail, And she said to my brother, "What's going on over here?" She said, "Oh, he's in a bit of pain. Something wrong with his back." So she came over to me. She said, "Do you mind if I just try something?" And I said, "No, no, go ahead." And she just moved her hands gently up and down my back like this, not touching my back. It was kind of just above my back. And then she just stopped and tapped my back with one hand and said, "It's there, isn't it?" And it was exactly where the pain was. And I said, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, that's it." She said, "Okay, do you mind if I try something else?" I said, "No, no, go ahead." And this was all through gritted teeth. I was in so much pain. And she said, "Okay, don't move." And she just started gently moving her hand like this in small circles, just above my back. And the whole area became absolutely red hot, really red hot. This was lasted for about a minute, no more than a minute or 2 minutes, and the pain just dissolved. And then she went over to my brother. Told me afterwards she went over to my brother and put her hand against his cheek, and apparently her hand. He said her hand was so hot it would like it had been in a fire. It was inexplicable, and it was inexplicable to me how she had taken this pain out of my back. And that was the first of a series of experiences that led me to realize there's more going on than I understand with just one part of my brain. And even with that experience, I buried it for a few years. I thought, well, that's just a funny thing that happens on the mountain. Yeah, don't know what that was, and just tried to sort of forget about it. But I've had many, many other experiences like that that have kind of shown me that there's much more going on than I can just process with my rational mind.
Wow, I appreciate you sharing that truly mysterious and mystical experience that you couldn't plan for at all. But I think you bring up a true principle that a lot of us overlook, which is it can be true and not explainable. And I think we live in a world where you have to, as the kids say, show the receipts for everything and have this deep certainty of it from a, again, rational standpoint. And it seems like in that moment, there was this transcendent power, very somatic based, or what we would call body based, that was able to bypass the mental capacities and, let's say, instill a truth in you and a physical healing in a way that, yeah, you needed but didn't know. And I also appreciate your honesty that you didn't just accept it right away and become a Reiki master yourself and, stretched out your back after. It's like, oh no, I kept it locked away for a couple years. And I think that's realistically how we come to most truths is we have these defining moments. And in that moment, I guess you could call it a light bulb moment. We know it's real. We know we've been changed and we know there's more here to explore, but it doesn't mean we're often ready to explore that to that degree. But it seems like it was a seed almost that then a few years later came more to fruition, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, but very nicely put. I think I absolutely rejected the experience and kind of said, "Oh, well, that's," kind of pretended it didn't happen. But when you experience something that embodied, it's undeniable. And I think it's instructive that I was in such a point of pain and suffering that I had no other option. I wasn't going to sort of. We were on the side of a mountain. There was nothing else I could ask for, and someone's offering to try and help. My defenses are down because I'm in so much pain. I think it's instructive that is when I experienced something like that. And it was, I think when something is that embodied, you can try to forget the memory, which is what I did, but you can't truly forget it. You can't truly ignore the fact that I was healed by someone barely moving their hand.
Yeah. And I do think, not to over extract meaning, but the fact that you were descending down the mountain, I think was symbolic. And it relates to the first part of your answer of being stuck in, corporate world and feeling like you have to fit into a box, but yet having that deep curiosity, which I would call the wild spirit every boy was born with, this need to extract the sense of exploration and adventure, and pursuing the transcendent and the unknown and not knowing how to balance that. And I think it's so true what you said that when you first decide to question the world you're in and start to leave it, or at least not give as much allegiance to it as you previously did, it feels like a descent. It feels like a detraction. It feels like a downgrade. And we see this a lot in the male rites of passage, where in a lot of ways it becomes worse before it becomes better. But your ability to trust that process, and it seems like you obviously did, which is, the pain of staying where I'm at is finally greater than the pain of whatever's on the other side of my fear. And while this sucks now and it feels humiliating, it feels degrading, it feels minimizing because you have no external validation, right? I mean, I'm sure people ask, well, what the hell are you doing with your life? Like, why are you trying that? That doesn't work. Or how do you know that's going to pan out how you think? And especially the voice of our parents, which tend to lean more towards that safety and security. So I'm curious for a guy that is now listening to this and is in that similar tipping point where he's at his desk job and he's listening to podcasts like this and he feels that sense of, I just gotta break free and try something new. What are some steps you may suggest in starting that process that doesn't feel like you just cut out everything, quit your job and move to Bali and become a yoga teacher? At the same time, maybe don't continue to stare at the Excel sheet on the screen.
I think it's really important that you said that, because often when I'm coaching people or even just having conversations with people, and they even try on the idea of making a change in their life, they go to that, well, I can't just go and quit and go to Bali. And it's like, well, no one's saying you have to. You don't have to burn your life and blow it up and go and do something on the other side of the world. For me, I think, I guess reflecting on my own journey, but also when I work with people one to one, pay attention to what you dream about or what you fantasize about. And it may be, yeah, it may be I want to go to Bali, and it doesn't mean you have to go to Bali. It doesn't mean you have to go to Bali and train as a yoga instructor. But what are the clues in that fantasy? What are the clues in that dream? And how can you take a small step towards those without blowing up your life? So it might be, okay, I'm just going to go and do a bit of yoga for a bit and spend a bit of time doing that. Still do the day job, still look at the Excel spreadsheets, but I'm just going to lean into that world a bit and see what happens. And if I get nothing back from it, if I feel nothing, that's fine. It's just an experiment. But to keep paying attention to those signs, those signals, that where does our mind wander to? What do we feel drawn to? And give it a bit of space to experiment with. And to give an answer to this, but also your previous question, another formative experience for me about 3 years after Kilimanjaro was I joined a smaller firm. I'd helped them to grow, and that had been a really great journey, but it now started to feel quite corporate again. And I felt this really strong urge for adventure. And I just felt like this can't be my life, just being in an office all the time. I was working with big banks and financial institutions. I thought, this can't be it. I want to be out in the wild somewhere. And I kept thinking about doing some sort of trip. And from somewhere, I got the idea of cycling down the west coast of the US. So I didn't even own a bike. So I asked for a sabbatical. I took 3 months off work, unpaid. I bought myself a bike, and with my girlfriend at the time, we cycled from Seattle to San Francisco. So it was around about 1,000 miles. It was an incredible trip, incredible trip. All sorts of things happened on that trip, but I realize now it was a kind of pilgrimage. I didn't mean it to be a pilgrimage, and I would never have used that word at the time. I was just going on an adventure. But I came back from that trip a different person to the one that left. And 2 or 3 days after I came back to work, I quit. I knew, and again, in a very embodied way, I walked back into this investment bank, and I just knew in my body, I was like, I can't do this. I can't do this anymore. And if I can't do it, that will become so evident in my day-to-day work. I'm here as a consultant. So I quit, and I had no work lined up. And I look back now and go, wow, how did I make that decision? Because I didn't have a lot of money in the bank, and I had a mortgage to pay. But I knew, some wiser part of me knew that I couldn't do it. So for me, it's just pay attention to where your attention is drawn to, your fantasies, your dreams, the things that you idly wonder about, and see in what way you can lean towards them.
Yeah, that's so helpful. And, it reminds me of Carl Jung's work with the archetypes, the symbols, and what we would call the meta meaning, the thing that transcends the context or the culture of the times and is so deeply true, it just resonates at your core. I think that's a great place to start because we can often jump right to judgment or, again, that certainty. Well, what are the practicals of being a yoga teacher in Bali, instead of saying, well, maybe it's your desire for rest or freedom or for yoga, the expansion or, stretching. But we have this very A plus B equals C, and it's like, well, that's not exactly how it works. So I appreciate you naming that need to stay curious in a grounded way, to say, of course, I live in reality, but what does this mean for my actual life, and how can I start to explore that? And then that second practical tip you said about the external physical adventure you went on, I do think that's so important. And it's a tough question to say, will you even commit and give yourself the time to sit with those thoughts. I'm sure, on mile 20, 30 on a long road for the day, as beautiful as the Pacific is, your focus actually drops inward and you get into this deep, reflective, introspective space that you only can get with a lot of deep time that's unstructured, that is not outcome based, that allows you to, really settle into the person that you are. And it allows you that time to really reflect, to be that person that you want to be, you're not sure could be, all these things. And it seems like you coming back to that consulting gig, you were at a crossroads. You knew, I know the truth now, where it feels like it would violate my personhood if I stayed. And again, going back to that cost, there's always the bills to pay, the risk to take, all these costs of it not working out. But it seems like for you, the greater question is, yeah, but what's the cost if I stay? What's really the price I'm going to pay if I am not faithful to this adventure I feel called on to? And the other thing is, you can always go back, but it seems like for you, that question, how did I make it happen? That the universe, God, the divine will match you in your risk taking. If you continue to take steps, it obviously unfolded to allow you to live it out in a way where you actually didn't have to go back to that way of living.
Yeah, absolutely. Talking to you now, when I have these conversations, it makes absolute sense in retrospect, because things always do. But at the time, it made no sense at all. I had no idea what was next and how this was going to pan out. And that, for me, is a very different way it's a very different way of living. And I think it's a way that runs counter to kind of our predominant culture, which is that you have a plan, that you think rationally, that you don't pay attention to what you feel, what your dreams are, what your soul is calling for. You don't pay attention to those things. You just kind of try to follow life in this linear way, because the other way is much messier, much more emergent. It's not always clear what's going on. But the more you do it, the more things just begin to make sense. Things begin to fall into some sort of place. And it's a very different, I think it's almost a countercultural way of living in the cultures that we live in, developed nations. And to go back to what you were saying earlier, kind of expand on the Jungian view, I guess. The fantasy doesn't have to be acted on, but if it's repressed, it can be just as damaging. If you completely ignore it, it can then, as you know, can spill out and come out in ways that are really deeply unhealthy.
Yes, I'm also a living testimony of that, where I have found there were times in my life where I knew I needed to deeply question something and come to terms with the reality of it. But the lie is, well, I don't want to enable it. I don't want to perpetuate it. But to your point, if I'm understanding, we have to at least accept it as real and as present and as active. And then from there, we say, but what's its role in my life? What do I need to do? And on that note, I think it would be good to talk about the sense of repression, suppression in that deep desire, in the sense of the roles we play as men. So let's talk about fathers and sons, role models, and modernity. Many men today feel disconnected from the traditional models of masculinity, but aren't sure what healthy alternatives look like. I feel like a lot of us are just, uh, you know, walking in the dark, and we realize, okay, I don't want to go back there, but I'm not really sure where I'm going. So I'm curious, how do you help men navigate this tension between honoring what came before us, which is really important to know that we're, standing on other shoulders of people who have paved the way, while also adapting to these modern realities that we face today as men?
Yeah, that is the tension that I think a lot of men are holding. And some men are dealing with it by reaching into the past for old ideas of what it means to be a man. Some are sort of looking forward and attempting to be progressive, or being whatever their version of progressive is. And many are just stuck in the tension. And I think the most important thing is to recognize that you feel the tension and to engage in the exploration. For me, there are no fixed answers to what an individual man should be. The strapline we use for Leader Brother Son is, there are 4 billion ways to be a man. And I think I think it's dangerous to be prescriptive about what men should do right now. What we can do is recognize the predicament. And the predicament is, many of the old models of manhood and masculinity are now becoming outdated. What we haven't figured out yet is a new story for men. And so we're in this kind of in between phase of, okay, what's my new story look like and how might I get there? Because that's partly an individual journey, but it's also partly a collective journey. And by collective, I mean your relationships, or if you have a partner, your relationship with your partner, your friendships, wider society, collectively. How do we change these narratives or develop new narratives? So, for example, if we look at fatherhood, we could say, okay, the old model was, your role is you go out to work, you provide for the family, you come home, you retire, you have children, you retire one day, that's it. Very simple, sort of narrative. Not easy to do, but that's kind of what it was. That's gradually shifting and changing. But what we haven't replaced it with is all of the things that need to change to enable a man to find a new version of that. And some of those are just very practical legal things like, regulations around paternity leave and all of those sorts of things. But also our own expectations about roles, gender roles in the context of a relationship, in the context of a family. That's not just the work of an individual man, that's the work of everyone to kind of say, okay, well, what could this look like? So if an individual man, this is a process gone through with my own wife, we sat down and said, okay, what do we want our lives to look like? What do you want from your career? What do I want from my career? How are we going to balance those? Let's be honest about the things we want beyond being as great parents as we can be. What are the other things we want to do? So we had a series of conversations around what we wanted our lives to look like and what we each needed from our future family life before our son was born. And what that then surfaced was, kind of the differing needs and the potential conflicts and the negotiations and bargains and compromises we're each going to have to make to enable that to happen. So it's an ongoing conversation for us. We've got some agreements, but we have to revisit those agreements. Are they still working for us? What's going to allow us each and collectively as a family to flourish as much as possible? And we're kind of fortunate in that we've both come from places of having done a lot of work and doing work in this sort of field. Not everyone has that. And that's what is, I think, what a lot of men are finding so difficult, because even though they might feel the need, okay, I want to be a different sort of dad or a different sort of partner, can they have that conversation with the other people in their life? Can they have that conversation with their employer to say, okay, this is the kind of way I want to, I want to shape my life. So there's a lot of change needed. It's not just individual, it's collective, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think you make a good point that the male expression is so contingent on the individual in a sense. And I do think it is important to name maybe some guiding principles or collective boundaries on what we may consider at least to be appropriate as a man, meaning, okay, we don't want to fall in the extremes on the right or the left, and to really live in this tension, which is so difficult. But what I hear in that is a call for every man to help define what it means to be a man by his own commitment to being honest with himself and those around him, to saying what feels true and real and helpful for myself and those around me. And I think you sitting down with your wife is such a brilliant step that a lot of guys can take, whether you're single or with a partner, which is we have to start with something to aim at. We know we can't stay where we're at. And it takes that non-rational mindset to say, we're not going to be able to explain it necessarily, but let's find something that feels challenging yet approachable and authentic to us individually, but also collectively in a way that helps us give something to be accountable for. I imagine you had that first conversation, but you share, with your wife here my goals. And then 6 months later, hey, Jenny, how's that going? Or, hey, you said you wanted to do this or try this or become this. Just curious where you're at with that. Or I feel like there's more here for you to explore, and just it gives you something to work towards. And I think I find in my work with a lot of men is they want this deep sense of adventure, but also the dignity to feel like they're actually doing well. And if you don't have anything to aim at, I think that's really hard to connect it to. But it seems like, as you're saying, it starts with knowing who you are, aiming for some goals, inviting the closest people to you around that, whether it's your partner or close friends or family, and then starting to refine it as you continue on.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it begins with a really high degree of self-honesty and working on that, as you said, figuring out who you are and what you want and that self-awareness. Because I notice in my conversations with men quite a lot of sophisticated self-deception. And I think a lot of it is unconscious. The stories and conditioning about the way that they should be living their lives that they haven't questioned or challenged. And that can, in the context of a relationship, that can then become unconsciously collusive. You both entered into this relationship kind of without knowing it, putting each other in gender roles or a specific kind of role. And further down the line, you then realize one or both of you might realize you're kind of trapped in those roles and you don't want to be anymore. So I think there's a lot about actually, what do I really want? What's most important to me? Do I want loads of adventure in my life? Do I really want to succeed as much as possible in my career? If we're going to have kids, what sort of parent do I want to be? What do I want my relationship to look like? What are we going to do together as a couple? All of those sorts of questions. How often do I want to see my friends? What about my hobbies? All of those things, and being as deeply honest about each of those things as you can, even though the answers might be inconvenient, even though the answers might give you that feeling we were talking about earlier. The answer is not necessarily, well, I've got to do that. I want to spend 4 weeks a year, kind of trekking mountains. That doesn't mean that's what you're going to do, but you have to pay attention that you've got that desire in you. So how can you resolve that desire in some way? And that's a very personal example, actually. My happiest place, both my wife and I need time away from the family every now and again. So that's one of the agreements we've made with each other. How can we help each other to do that? And 3 weeks ago, she went away to do some training in the Spanish mountains for a week. She came back. We overlapped by 12 hours and I went hiking for 3 days in the French Alps because the mountains are, my kind of happy place. And I went trekking with a friend. And that is the way I kind of scratch that itch and just give myself a little bit of that feeling. We both come back from those experiences refreshed, feeling like we've done something that's deeply meaningful for ourselves. So it's that sense of partnership and how can we support each other in, in some way at least fulfilling some of our desires and our needs.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that personal example. And the word I hear in all of that is intentionality. And it's not appropriate for us to settle for, I don't know, in the sense of it's willful ignorance. Now, you shouldn't shame yourself for not knowing. That's natural. But you shouldn't allow yourself to stay at a place where you just don't know, because it really is this default reactive way of living. Well, my friends are just my friends and who cares, whatever. We kind of do whatever. I'll let it unfold and happen. Or this relationship, who knows where it's going to head. I'm just enjoying the moment. And of course, it's again so important to be present and not try to choke the life out of the adventure you're on to try to explain everything. And I think we do have this responsibility, and what I hear you saying, that is to say, what is your desire? What are your capacities? How do you want to express yourself as a person? And you owe it to yourself to get that real and honest assessment. And as you said, the answers that await you might be aggravating and frustrating and daunting even. But also, it should strike you, if you don't know, to say, well, why don't I know?
Mm.
If I say I care about this person or this career, where I live, then why am I okay with not knowing? And sitting with that question and letting it really strike you to, what I like to say, unpack the apathy, to get to the core of feeling and vibrance again, to say, the worst thing is to just be neutral. It would be way better for you to say, I hate this or I love that, than just to say, I don't care. And I think a lot of us men feel stagnant or stuck and paralyzed by not having it figured out. And we unintentionally, as you said earlier, suppress that need to be intentional and stay where we're at.
Yeah, I love that phrase, unpacking the apathy. I'll be borrowing that. I'll reference you. I think I that really resonates with me. I see, and this was myself earlier in my life, a lot of sort of silent suffering and self medication, often through drugs or alcohol or some other just generic sort of vice. Kind of eating unhealthily, kind of, just I'll work hard all week and then I'll just slob out the weekend and that's my life, and I'll maybe see my friends and catch the football or whatever it is. Just as you said, falling back into this default mode of living rather than going, actually, what do I really want to do? Because if I ignore that, then apart from anything else, I'm living a less rich life. But also there's the potential for a lot of pain and suffering further down the line. And that will affect not just you, but the people around you as well. So we both recognize that for us to go and feed ourselves by going and doing some of the things we care about, we bring some of that back into the family. There's almost the kind of hero's journey aspect to it. We come back with some gold from going and looking after ourselves for a bit by doing the things that we want to do. So I think that's essential.
Yeah, I do as well. And I think many men don't feel worth taking care of themselves and saying, I just want to do this to do it. And it's not a selfish thing because it actually ends up helping you be selfless and be generative and give back to your partner, to your family, to the people around you. But it can often feel taboo, which leads me to my next question. You know, you've noted the pitfalls in our current discourse around masculinity, patriarchy, and similar themes. You know, the language itself seems to shut down on either side. You find yourself rather than open up these meaningful conversations similar to the ones we're having. So I'm curious, how do you move beyond those polarized discussion, maybe those trigger words or ideologies, to create a space for men to have these honest conversations about these topics?
I suppose the first answer, the simplest answer that springs to mind is I try to avoid using those terms at all because they are so polarizing. They often are contested. If you say the word patriarchy, it means so many different things to different people. It sets people in opposition to each other. It puts people on edge. And most people don't understand what that term means. Same with feminism. You know, even a term like masculinity can be contested. What does it actually mean? So certainly in the context of either one-on-one or group conversations with men, I don't really use that language at all. It's just talking to the human in front of you. You know, what's going on with you? What are you struggling with right now? And approaching it that way. And I think that is part of what's missing from our discourse, that we see each other at an identity level rather than just speaking to the human being and being curious about their experience. What's going on with you right now? What are you struggling with? And let's put aside whether you're male, female, you know, your race, your sexuality, anything else. Just what's going on with you? What are you struggling with? There was I was doing a talk a couple of weeks ago. There's a civil rights activist in the US called Ruby Sales, who you may have heard of. And she talks a lot about the crisis in white male masculinity in the US. And she's a woman, she's a black woman who's encountered a lot of racism. And she's realized in the course of her work, I think she's in her sort of 70s now or something, that this was coming from a place of pain and suffering amongst white men in the US. And she said she describes it as a kind of spiritual crisis. So her guiding inquiry is, where does it hurt? So when she encounters people who are inflicting hatred on other people, where does it hurt? Where's your pain? And she has the capacity to sit and look with empathy at a white man who is expressing racist views and go, this is a person in pain. This is a person in suffering. So where is that this person's wound? And I find that really inspiring to hear about that sort of work.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning her. I heard her on Krista Tippett's On Being podcast years ago, and that same question struck me and really was helpful to me in the healing process, especially from someone who has done the work and can be grounded and to look at one of the greatest source of for her pain and to ask that person, where does it hurt? It takes a lot of deep, intentional, committed, loving care to be able to ask that question in the way that she does. And I agree. I think going back to that male rites of passage or the adventure, the hero's journey, there is always that spot in male spirituality, which we would call the capital W great wounding. It always has to start with realizing what's the thing that I don't want to acknowledge that is keeping me from where I want to be, that is humiliating, embarrassing, that I want to hide. And that instead of dealing with it, I use it to project and hurt other people. But that question is so disarming because there's a deep sense of care in the question. Is that, where does it hurt? Like, I want to know. And it's paradoxical because while it's simultaneously caring, it's also painful to have to answer the question, to come in contact with the wounding, to be present to the pain and where you're at and actually deal with it. So I appreciate you sharing that because we live in this culture that really idolizes outcomes and achievements and all these things and how much we can continue onwards and upwards. But so much of it is actually either going back to the past or sitting with the present with that question, where does it hurt? And just letting that wound work on you until you find healing, as you said it did for all those years until you were able to move into that next phase of maturity?
It's something I think about a lot, and I wrote something recently about there's a lot of anger around at the moment, and I was reflecting on there was riots in the UK last October, lots of sort of groups of mostly men, but not just men, going back to the Capitol insurrection, January 6th. Again, mostly men, looking at all that anger and aggression and violence, but trying to get beneath that to go, why are these men so angry? And certainly speaking from a UK perspective, but I think it probably applies to the US, at least part of the answer is of um, and this is where I think we have to be systemic. Generations of growing inequality, unemployment. In some areas of the UK, they're still struggling from the shutdown of the mines. Quite a lot of where these riots were former mining towns, industrial towns that since the early 80s have been in severe deprivation. So you have generations of people who struggle to find employment, particularly men, and they struggle to get into higher education. They're struggling to get into relationships. So they are an ideal constituency to be preyed on by certain politicians and certain ideologies. And so what we see, and this kind of politicians are quick to condemn it, and I'm not in any way sort of accepting of violence or aggression, but there's no curiosity of where that's come from. Where has that arisen from? And where it's arisen from is a deep place of pain and suffering that if we look at it, then we say that it invites us into more complicated questions. Actually, how do we avoid this happening in the first place? Because if we can provide a young man with a sense of secure employment, the ability to get housing, to get into a relationship, to educate himself if he wants to, if he's able to do those things, he's highly unlikely to develop hatred towards other people in his life, and highly unlikely to go out onto the streets and inflict violence and aggression towards other people. But that's a much more complicated systemic challenge that we have to address.
Yeah, I appreciate you naming that because where someone finds themselves, especially if we use this framework of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, really shows how they got to where they are. That no one woke up and just said, this is what I want to act out on. That you have all these experiences that compounded lead to a tipping point or breaking point where they do these things, which, as you said, you can have a empathetic and compassionate understanding. Now, it doesn't mean, as you said, we excuse it as being appropriate, but we can at least know, if I've never met someone that enjoys their work and has job security, has really healthy, deep relationships, is self-aware, and falls into that category of someone that would want to do that. And it's something I agree with you. I think that while it's challenging, it's doable to continue to support men, to say the more dignity you find in yourself, the less you want to use that dignity to as power to rule and to reign over people through the violence, and to actually come up under people and to serve and to be generous. And my sense of anger as an emotion, I like to call it a protective emotion. It tells you what you care about. It's a really important emotion. And unfortunately, it's one that many men are taught not to experience. Don't get angry. You need to settle down. I actually think that it's misexpressed protection. So instead of protecting your community, the people around you, and yourself, you use it through violent actions, as you gave in the insurrection example, to actually create more unsafety, more harm, more risk. And we want to name that anger and say, hey, it's important you feel angry, but why? Why do you feel angry? What do you care about? Oh, you want justice, you want peace, you don't feel heard or seen. All valid things. The invalid thing is that you would express it through violence to try to get that, instead of being honest with yourself about why you don't have those things. Why don't you feel seen? Why don't you feel dignified in your work? Why do you feel like you're not progressing? And I find that a lot of that violence comes out of this deep internalized shame. If I can't find a job, if I can't get into a relationship, the painful question is, well, what's wrong with me? Like, what went so wrong in my life that this is where I'm at? And I see those insurrection events and these acting out of violence as a cry for help for a man to feel powerful and in control and dignified. It's just the worst way to express it. And instead of finding it in your real life, you feel like you have to overstep the boundaries and do it in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Amen to that. I think it's anger that has been repressed or not processed and then has been weaponized against some cause or some other group. And I think dignity is the key word. If you don't feel you have dignity, then someone comes along and says, well, the reason you're struggling is because of this group of people over here. It's very easy for your anger to then be directed towards that group of people, because that gives you, as you said, some sense. At least I've got some sense of power. If I can be aggressive or dominate this group, at least that makes me feel something. Gives me some sense of, albeit shallow or false dignity. That's gonna work, and that is working, and that's what we need to tackle.
I agree. And we need to create spaces for men to have these conversations, which leads me to my last question. Through your organization, Leader Brother Son, you are creating these spaces for men to explore topics that often go unspoken or are not allowed to have, or at least men don't feel like they can. What are the conversations that men are hungry to have but feel they can't have elsewhere? What happens when you give men permission to be vulnerable with each other?
Yeah, that's a really great and important question, because often people assume that we have some sort of men show up and have these conversations about really sort of controversial topics and air all sorts of horrible views. Actually, they tend to show up, and this is partly because of what we invite them in. This is a space for you to come and have a conversation about things as men, but we don't say anything is off limits. But what we've seen over and over again is the same sorts of topics tend to come up. So there's um, topics in each conversation, and it's things like money, work, relationships, friendship, stress, mental health, anxiety, sex. So it's these sorts of topics where men are sort of coming and sharing their stories and experiences and things that they're struggling with individually. But I'd say there's a meta theme. I realized after a few years there's a meta theme, and one of them is a real longing for community, a real longing for a sense of sort of brotherhood, connection with other men, to be in a space where you can have these sorts of conversations with men and you're not judged, you're not offered advice unless you ask for it. You feel completely safe and secure just being able to share and air these things, and you're hearing and witnessing other men do the same. And there's a real sense of I've been longing for this, because I haven't had this since, in most cases, since I was a child, since I was an adolescent. When we were quite intimate with our friends before we reached our sort of teenage years and we started to reject intimacy, there's this sense of I've been missing this. And this Robert Bly describes it as food, this unconscious transmission between men and boys. It's food that men are giving to each other. So that's the kind of topics and themes that come up.
Yeah, I appreciate you naming that, especially that last part about how intimacy was just normal until someone said it was gay or weird or uncomfortable. And we internalize these things and then we keep them to ourselves because we say, well, I don't want to be embarrassed. And then it's a culture of either competition or certainty, where either you have to be better than someone so you can't appear weak, like, and admit I don't know something, because then that shows that someone's better than you, smarter than you, stronger than you, all these things, and you'll be crushed more or less. Or the certainty, which is you have to appear like you have it all together, like you're self-reliant, like you know it all. And those things actually keep you from having these conversations of all the topics you mentioned, which we all relate to it. And we all have the same kind of questions. What does it mean to show up in my relationship? Is this normal? I don't know how to go about this. And what I hear you saying is you create space just to allow men to let their guard down, to even ask the questions and explore it. And that when you see another man ask the same question or get vulnerable, it frees you up to do the same. And this is something I've noted, that I think we've made a mistake, that we ask men to open up in a non-manly way, let's say, which is we try to fit them into a cultural box instead of allow them to express their experience and who they are as a person, in particular to their experience as a man in a group of men. And you do see men open up different. I even find that the way I'm intimate with my buddies, my guy friends, is more particular to them than my wife. And it's not to say one is better or worse, but it's to say you can't just have the intimacy with a lover or a romantic partner. You have to have that space of men, because that modeling of that shared experience is the thing that allows you to bond, but also to make sense of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's usually different with men, with groups of men. It's usually different. And we lean a lot into inviting people to share stories. So there's no kind of, you don't have to go. to any particularly deep place, just share a story about something related to this. And that in itself that's kind of a really easy step to take, or easier step to take than say, let's get intimate, be really vulnerable, be open, kind of. For me, vulnerability happens that's another word I don't really use very much. It happens as a byproduct of a space that feels safe and open, and where you're witnessing other men sharing openly. And it's a gradual process, kind of the trust builds in a group, and it can build quite quickly over the course of one conversation. A group can start to sort of really open up and connect with each other. And something we have heard in every single group we've run is, well, there's two things we always hear. One is, it's great to know I'm not alone. And this is guys from all over the world, different ages, different backgrounds, different races, different sexualities, and they're hearing themselves in each other's stories. And the other thing we often hear, or always hear, at least once in a group, is, I've never told anyone this before. Or, yeah, I've told you guys things that I haven't told my best friends. And it's amazing. These guys are strangers. They come together and they're in a space where they feel they can do that. And part of it is just they're being asked the question in a space that feels safe. And that in itself can just allow those stories to come forward.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I appreciate how you don't jump right to using the language similar to the cultural language earlier, because it so quickly stifles the ability to actually get real and to feel safe in those things. And by bypassing the language and just allowing someone to speak for it and then putting the language to it, is what I would call a helpful or wise guide to allow someone to share the experience and then say, hey, here may be a name, a structure, some boundary that may help this make sense or encapsulate what you're trying to say. And it's so cool that you are over here leading all these men's groups, and this is the core at your work. And what I hear you saying is just create the space, just allow guys to talk and to share, and the vulnerability will come natural, because a man deep down wants to be known, he wants to be seen. And I like that you said those questions. I haven't told my best mate this, or I haven't told my wife or girlfriend this. I think it speaks to that desire for, not that a man doesn't have the capability, but he needs the same thing every person needs, which is to feel safe in order to unlock and step into the capability. But it proves itself when the space is created, when the conversations are had, men get real, they get close, and they get better.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's reminding me just something you said there about bypassing language. I think there's many, many different ways to bring men together. Um, so most of my work is around conversation led, so it's very verbal. And it's even within verbal group settings, there's a whole variety of ways in which these groups are run. I know lots of people doing this sort of work, and there's many different ways to do it. And I'm sure you know lots of modalities as well. But there's also non-verbal ways. There's a guy I spoke to not long ago who's a bushcraft instructor, and he lives in Scotland. He used to, I think maybe 20 years ago, he used to do work with gang members in LA. They like teenagers who are involved in gangs, and they'd take them out into the sort of wilderness in California. And so his work is far less verbal. It's more physical, more embodied. Getting people around a campfire to make a meal together. You don't need to say anything, but he says what he's found is meaningful conversations tend to happen naturally. But also quite a lot happens non-verbally. So he described this one time that they'd been sitting around a fire and they were getting up to carry on their hike. And one of the guys got up and he had a disability, so he was struggling a bit with his jacket. And one of the other guys just saw this, and without saying a word, he didn't say, "Oh, can I come and help you?" or do you need some help? He just came, and he could see that his hood needed adjustment. He just came from behind him, just gave his hood a little tug, patted him on the back, and went, "There you go." And that was it. And for him, that was such a simple, intimate moment of a man helping another man. No words are really exchanged, but a real sense of connection between those two men.
Yeah, that's a really powerful story. And it reminds me, I had another guest on, and we were exploring the sense of rite of passage in the West. What does it look like? Because all the examples we tend to use are more African or tribal, or just not developed first world countries. And he brought up that it was the agrarian society, that it was the boy that would be next to his father working in the field, or even working on a car or something. And it's not that that generation was spilling these emotions or life lessons and being very verbose. They just silently modeled what it what it means to be a man and to emulate that. And it was the job, but also the desire of the one trying to learn or receive the help to pay attention and to learn, like you said, non-verbally. I think that's so powerful, considering many men are so tactile. We learn from getting our hands on things. Don't know. You said you had a son. I'm curious if he does this. My boy, he's just like grabs everything, and you can just tell he's trying to make sense of his limits and capabilities, but not just in this strongman weightlifting, bush hogging way where it's like, I'm going to go out and chop a bunch of stuff, but as simple and as gentle and loving as putting on a hood and adjusting it. I mean, how intimate a moment those two shared. And yet it doesn't need to be said, oh, that was vulnerable. That was caring. It just was what it was. The moment, unadulterated, spoke for itself. And we need more moments of that as men, where we don't need to acknowledge it or to turn it into a business or try to explain it. We can just let it be what it is. But to create more space for that to happen, I think is so therapeutic.
Yeah, there's always the temptation to label things and kind of notice things and go, oh, look at that, but sometimes it happens and that's it. And that thing is exchanged between two or more people. And that, I think it was Robert Bly again who said the father-son relationship is the most damaged of all relationships due to the Industrial Revolution, because in agrarian societies, fathers and sons in particular would spend most of the day together and they would be doing physical things alongside each other. And that was fundamentally broken once fathers started to go off somewhere else to work, to places of work, to factories, to shipyards, to construction sites. So it's how do we get that back? How do we bring those some sort of rites of passage, some sort of proximity to each other back again? Yeah, I've noticed in my own son, he's mimicking me all the time, and he's wanting to do things that exceed his capability, lifting things that are too heavy for him because he sees me lifting something, and that's a beautiful thing to just see. I'm not trying to teach him that. He's just mimicking. It's a natural thing to do.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I feel the same. And it's a deep conviction within me to say, yes, I need to be committed to my work that maybe doesn't involve him, but also what work can I do that does involve him? Where are the touch points day to day that I can have these moments with him where we're not just sitting down doing something structured, but it leaves that open time, whether it's meals in the evening or weekends or taking him on trips, just committing to saying, while it is important to, again, do what I feel called to do, I never want to compromise my role as a father. And while that can seem daunting and challenging, and how can I do that? I think there is space for that. And I appreciate that I have another brother and friend on the journey, as I'm sure you know, many others that are attempting to say, but it's worth the shot, because it's the difference in helping raise a mature, a stable, loving, and true man, and one that continues to fall into the statistics and stereotypes that we've seen up to this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you for sharing, Jindy. I appreciate your time today. And I'm curious, and we'll put this in the show notes, where people can find you.
So yeah, a couple of places. Our website is leaderbrotherson.com. We run our free groups for 8 weeks at a time. We're taking a bit of a break at the moment, but we'll be starting the next one later this summer. So leaderbrotherson.com, you can inquire about our free men's circles. My coaching website is selfishleader.com. And if you go and look at it, it might be down because I'm planning to sort of rebuild it and do other stuff with it. LinkedIn is where I spend most of my time. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Jindy Mann. I don't think there's many of us. Substack. I have two Substacks, one that's Leader Brother Son and one that's more my personal one. And I write regularly there. So that's where I share a lot of my sort of thinking and reading and research and other things that I'm looking at.
We'll make sure that people check those out, and appreciate you deciding to take that risk all those years ago, from the cubicle to the jungle of life in this adventure. And yeah, this conversation was just really beautiful and much needed. So I appreciate you taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
Well, thank you, Wes. Really appreciate you inviting me on, and very thoughtful and connecting conversation. And I feel like I've been in conversation with someone who is quite like-minded, and we're on similar journeys. So I really appreciate you.
Yes, me too. All right, guys. Until next time.